Thank you for attending the population stage here at Mumbrella 360 Asia. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Damien Francis. I'm the head of event content at Mumbrella. I'll be keeping things moving here today at the population stage. So just a bit of housekeeping. Please don't feel like you need to rush off at any stage during the session to attend others. We're all keeping them in sync. So you can stay till the very end and still make the next session in other rooms if you're going to different rooms throughout the day. So first up, I'd like to introduce our first speaker for this room, Mr. Lou Hoffman, the CEO of the Hoffman Agency. And he's going to be presenting an extremely interesting session today. Does the public relations industry really get storytelling? And I think this is a extremely pertinent session for the industry at the moment. Since his first agency job in 1983, Lou has been observing the relationships between clients, client executives and their clients, and the idea of staying on message. He's been trying to assess the situation, undo the damage that's been happening, and get both parties to understand the opportunities that storytelling is providing and how to actually do it clearer and better. Now, with this in mind, he shaped the Hoffman Agency into communications consultancy that brings storytelling and storytelling techniques to the forefront of business. Lou and his wife Heather launched the company of the same name in 1987 and expanded it from Silicon Valley. And it's become a global player with offices in Asia and Europe as well as the United States. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Lou Hoffman to the stage.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for spending this morning with me on the subject of storytelling. Just real quickly, I'd like to just see a show of hands. How many people are on the consultancy side? Okay, some, and then the rest are in-house? Great. Yeah, so if you think about storytelling conceptually, this is a topic that communicators have been talking about and beating the drum for some time. It's interesting to me, though, to kind of step back and think, do communicators really walk the talk when it comes to storytelling? And rather than just impose my view on it, I thought it'd be interesting to do a little bit of research. So I'm going to show you some research on getting the perception of communicators and how they think they're doing with storytelling. I think it's kind of interesting, and it ends up showing us a bit of a disconnect. Before doing that, though, I want to talk about my own journey with storytelling. As Damien mentioned, I got my first agency job in 1983, and my boss and my boss's boss proceeded to teach me that one of my main missions in life was to make sure that our executives stayed on message. Stay on message, stay on message, stay on message. And it got to the point where I felt like it wasn't even like staying on message. We pummeled our executives to regurgitate messages. And in the course of doing this, I got pretty good at it. But I started to notice something a bit queer, and that was the more an executive stayed on message, the less interesting he became to the journalist. And I started to see that the closer he came to reciting that perfect, pristine message, the less interested the journalist was. And then the opposite happened when the executive went off message and started to talk like a human being. All of a sudden, the journalist kind of would stand up in his chair, and he got a lot more interested. And I thought, well, shoot, this kind of doesn't make sense to me. Why are we're crushing the executives to try to be uninteresting to the outside world? And that, for me, was kind of the start of what I considered to be kind of this lifelong student of storytelling and understanding how to communicate in a way that interests people. Fast forwarding to today, incredible amount of digital content out there, right? We all see it every day in our jobs. I think what's important here is not necessarily to kind of understand what a zettabyte is, lots of zeros in front of the one, but it's the acceleration of content that we see happening. Things are moving incredibly fast in terms of content creation. And it's a great opportunity for all of us in the room on the communication side, but it means that we have to be good at developing content. You always hear this phrase, content is king, content is king, content is king, but I don't agree with that. Good content is king, compelling content is king, but there's a lot of bad stuff out there. So I want to get back to the question of, does PR get storytelling? As I mentioned earlier, I wanted to share with you some research that we did. We put together a Facebook advertising campaign that was hyperlinked to a SurveyMonkey, and we went out to PR people and communicators largely through South Asia and a little bit throughout all of Asia. So it worked out super well. We got over 400 responses. You can see the breakdown here from consultancy, from in-house. In fact, we didn't plan it this way, but it turns out that 400 plus respondents roughly split between consultancy and in-house. Also, a nice mix of experience. So it was people with less than 2 years, 2 to 5, 5 to 10, 10 to 15, 15 to 20, and 20 plus. And again, it kind of nicely split among all those experience levels. So this starts to give us kind of a sense of how the communications people think they're doing with storytelling. So the very first question we asked, do you believe your agency or department consistently creates content that resonates with the target audience? And you can see here, 44% feel like not necessarily, that a lot of their content misses the mark. So when I saw this, my initial reaction was, this is a good thing. This is actually a good thing because you have to kind of acknowledge that maybe there's an issue or there's a problem before you can start to address it. So I thought, this survey is off to a promising start. I'm looking forward to the rest of the input. But then we quickly see, and I thought this was interesting, we asked people, what are the major obstacles to creating high-quality content? People could choose up to 3 things. And you can see here, head and shoulders above everything else was research. And then 2 and 3, don't understand the target audience and deadlines. So I thought this was kind of interesting to me, and you think about lack of research is the #1 thing holding us back. It definitely doesn't align what I'm seeing out in the marketplace. This was a really key question we asked. If you audited all the content created by your department or agency this year, what % of the content would be anecdotal? And I think anecdotes end up being a fantastic indicator of how we're doing with storytelling. Because a lot of times, corporate executives, especially when they come from technical orientations, they tend to think of anecdotes as a bit fluffy, as a bit inconsequential. But actually, they end up being incredibly powerful in bringing texture and vibrance to communications, whether it's oral or whether it's written. And so what we said is we kind of, again, we bucketed this into groups, less than 5%, 5 to 10, 10 to 15, 15 to 20, and 20 plus. So that's what you see here, and I thought this was quite optimistic, actually. You can see roughly 75% think it's more than 5%, and roughly 40% think that anecdotal content is more than 10%. I mentioned that anecdotes end up being a great indicator of storytelling, and I think the best storytellers on the planet are journalists when it comes to nonfiction content, nonfiction stories. And so one thing that we did a couple years ago is we went through 3 months' worth of The Economist, and we actually deconstructed all those stories to kind of understand for journalists, what % of their content is anecdotal. Anyone want to throw out a guess on 3 months' worth of The Economist? What % of that content would be anecdotal? Any guesses? Okay, it's okay. 17%. 17%. And what's interesting to me is if you do this through any major publication when it comes to feature stories, you find this number it roughly toggles around that. 16, 17, 18, sometimes as much as 20% is anecdotal. And then finally, a question we asked was, do you believe anecdotal content has a place in news releases? And you can see here the vast majority, 72%, think absolutely it does. So that's kind of one side of the equation. This is the perception of communicators and how they see themselves in terms of applying storytelling to their jobs. I'm now going to kind of flip it around a little bit. And the second thing we did is we took 50 randomly selected news releases distributed through Asia. And again, we deconstructed those to look at the content. And the main thing we were trying to look at in these news releases is, are they showing or are they telling? So in the United States, when you're in high school English, this is a big speaking pulpit for any English teacher. Is show, don't tell. And this idea of telling is this idea of just throwing superlatives at people. And instead, you want to show them so they end up concluding that those superlatives in their mind. So just to give you a quick example of that and what they mean by show, don't tell. If I stand in front of you this morning and I say to you, I'm a great dad. I am a great dad. What do you automatically think? Anyone? Yeah, maybe, exactly, right? Because when you throw superlatives out, when you brag, automatically our BS detector goes up, and we get our filter of information gets a lot more finely tuned. We get cynical when people do this. But if I stand in front of you and I tell you my kids, Elliot and Grace, son, daughter, they were interested in learning how to make French crepes for breakfast. And so I went out to the store and I got this fancy crepe pan, and I went on the internet. I got this recipe that said can't fail crepes. And we followed that recipe with my kids step by step by step by step. And we ended up with a bunch of mush. The crepes had the consistency of mashed potatoes. It was not a good experiment. We ended up going out for breakfast and having a nice time. So, still, I tell you that, maybe you still don't think I'm a great dad, but you get a sense that I'm engaged with my kids, right? So that's the power of showing, not telling, that I'm talking about. So, back to those news releases, those 50 random news releases, we deconstructed them, and one thing we looked at was the ratio of adjectives and adverbs, because adjectives and adverbs end up being a bit of a crutch and kind of an easy path away from storytelling. That doesn't mean that you can't use adjectives and adverbs effectively. You absolutely can, but a lot of times what you see in communications is they end up being bragging adjectives and adverbs. Again, a sense that we're telling the audience something, we're not showing them. So the flip side of that is we took a look at those news releases and we asked ourselves, what percent is anecdotal? And it turns out that 3% of those 50 news releases had anecdotal content. And just to draw you back, this is what the perception was in communicators. People think they're using a lot more anecdotal content than they are. And then finally on the news releases, I always think it's interesting and it's a good test to look at the kinds of quotes. So are those quotes showing or are those quotes telling? And the other thing that I think is interesting to look at is whether we're seeing conversational language in the quotes. If there was ever a place that we should see conversational language in a news release, it's in a quote, right? It's in a quote. People are supposed to be talking like human beings. But I just want to show you kind of a sampling of those quotes that we pulled out of those news releases. And you can see them here. This is an exciting direction. We are very proud. We are delighted. We are thrilled. I am proud. We are excited. Boeing is excited. It is great to honor. Innovation is at the core of our values. I am proud to welcome. We are honored to receive. We are proud. Yeah, so not exactly conversational and definitely not showing, right? Telling. The final little exercise we went through is the LinkedIn test. And if you think about it, if we're good at storytelling and constructing stories for our clients or our companies, it stands to reason that we would know how to create a story about ourselves. And so I think it's interesting to me, and I went through, I just kind of randomly, I went on LinkedIn, I plugged in geography for Asia and PR function, and I just started looking through people's LinkedIns. It's not a pretty picture. Okay, so this is just one, and I don't mean to pick on this person, and I purposely tried to black out his name so no one knows who he is, but this is one of the most senior, talented PR leaders in the region. Happens to be based in China. And what I did, and what you're going to see on the next click, is we're going to highlight adjectives and adverbs, and we're going to get a sense, is he showing or is he telling? And you can see, it's all tell, right? It's all bragging, innovative, award-winning, most influential, one of the top 25, unprecedented, And by the way, I don't mean to pick on this individual, because the reality is that most of the LinkedIns out there look about like this. So if we kind of step back and we go back to that question, is PR, our communicators, walking the talk when it comes to storytelling? I would suggest that we're not, and that we definitely have work to do. And so what I want to do with the rest of today's session is just to get all of you thinking just a little bit differently about language and about how you use words and how you construct content for your clients and companies, because there are ways that we can absolutely get this back on track. So the very first one, to be willing to take a more outward focus with the content we develop for our clients or for our companies. And the way I always think about this is if you go to a party or you go to a bar or even here at the Umbrella Conference and you meet someone new, and that person right off the bat goes on to talk about themselves, and they're talking about themselves and they go on and on and on, what do we end up doing? I mean, we try to do it politely, we try to do it with some finesse, but what we try to do when that person is going on and on and on about themselves is we try to extract ourselves from the situation, right? And we try to kind of move on to someone who's going to be a little more interesting. And the thing that has always struck me is, why do companies think that this dynamic is any different? It doesn't make sense. So the one thing that we can absolutely do that will give our content lift and start to get us more along the lines of storytelling is this idea of taking an outward focus and trying to avoid boasting and bragging about ourselves. Let's give people the content that leads them to the conclusion that we're innovative, that we're great, that we've got effective solutions, not tell them and bang them over the head with it. Second thing, and I brought this up earlier, that we need as a profession, we need to get the anecdotal religion. We need to work at it, make a conscious effort to bring anecdotes more into the content that we construct. I just want to share with you an example. I know it's a little tough to read out there, but this comes from an old college buddy of mine, and he's a public affairs officer for a Navy squadron. And he called me because he knows I'm in the communications business, and he said, look, here's the situation. The Navy squadron I support rescued 4 people that were lost at sea in the Pacific Ocean, the parents and 2 kids, on day number 6. They were lost for 6 days, so they were about to perish. The Navy squadron found them from above. They rescued them, took them back, and they ended up being healthy and survived and no problems. And he goes, do you think that's a story that the media will be interested in? And I said, are you kidding me? family of 4 about to perish in the Pacific Ocean. At the 11th hour, the Navy finds them, saves them. Of course they will. And I gave him some thoughts on how he might package that story. And he went out and he pitched it. And guess what happened? No one was interested in the story. No one wanted to write the story. This is a true story. So he calls me back and he says, "You were wrong. No one's interested in my story." And he goes, "What do you think if I just at least post it on our Facebook page?" So this is the Navy Squadron. This is their Facebook page. And I said, "Well, shoot, yeah, of course. You should do that. It couldn't hurt." So he posted on the Facebook page. And then one of the guys, random guy from outside, asked the question. The photo comment says, "Good thing the Nomads," the Navy Squadron, "spotted their signal mirror. What type of signal mirror did they use? How far was the boat from the aircraft when the mirror was spotted?" So the idea was that somehow the family of 4 had found a way to reflect the sun up back into the sky, because otherwise a plane's so high above the ocean that it can't see a boat. And it turns out, so my friend, the public affairs officer, goes and he finds the Navy Squadron leader and he asked him how they did it. And it turns out, from 10,000 feet up, 5 miles out, it was the bottom of a soda can. It's actually the bottom of a Coke can that saved them. So now, my friend, his name's Mike Wendelin, he goes out and he repitches the story, and guess what? People are now interested. So the story appears on local TV, and from there it builds up steam. It ends up going viral. The story ends up going viral and ends up in USA Today. And I always feel like this is such a fantastic example of the power of anecdotes. Think about this. Family of 4, lost in the Pacific Ocean, rescued. No one wants to write the story. Family of 4, lost in the Pacific Ocean, saved by a Coke can, and now everyone wants to write the story. So I think, as I said earlier, a lot of times I feel like anecdotes get undervalued, and they can be so powerful in bringing texture and interest to our stories. I also want to talk about this idea of harmonizing words and images, and this is huge. We're seeing an increasingly amount of content that gets consumed on mobile devices, and there's no getting around this idea that attention spans go down on mobile devices. And so we have to get more visual. We have to get more visual in how we build out our content and build out our stories. And this can be a difficult one, I think, for people in communications, because we don't typically come from the design side of the world. We're history majors, we're poli-sci majors, we're mass communication majors, we're journalism majors, but not necessarily MFAs. So this is something I've been putting a lot of thought into, and it's not something I necessarily kind of invented, but I put a lot of effort into this concept that I call word visuals. And I think word visuals are perfect for communicators. And the idea of a word visual is it's an image. It's an image, but the words carry it, and they don't need industrial-grade design. So a lot of us do have art departments. We have the design departments we can lean on, and that's great, and we should absolutely do that. But the reality is that when we're trying to scale content, interesting content, especially for social channels where things are so disposable, we have to find efficient ways to create interesting images. And I really believe this idea of a word visual addresses that. And oh, by the way, just to digress for a minute, but still stay on storytelling, this idea of corporate speak and industry lexicon, and you put that together, it does make for really dull communication. So another technique of being able to make our storytelling more interesting is just to find stories, just to find words that are outside that industry lexicon. And even just one word sometimes can make things more interesting. So back on this idea of word visuals. So this is an example of a word visual. I just took the cover of a book, didn't take a lot of, like I said, industrial grade design, and we're able to fill in, why PR pros struggle with visuals, put it on a book. Another example is just a speech cloud, to be able to take an interesting photo and be able to add a speech cloud to it. Again, you end up with an image, but I think of it as a word visual because it's the words that really carry the image. So I want to kind of go back now in finishing up and take a look at kind of the big picture. And what you now see on the screen is what's referred to as the classic story arc. And if you think about the structure of this story arc, where you've got a beginning, you've got an end, and then you've got some things in between that go horribly wrong, and those things have to be paid off. And if you think about the last great movie you saw or the last good novel you read, it follows this structure in some fashion. There's bad stuff that happens to the main character, and somehow, some way, he or she needs to get over it. And this is something, too, I have put a lot of thought into, because we all talk about this idea of storytelling and how important it is to what we do, and it is, but I always feel like the dirty little secret no one wants to talk about is this classic story arc. In a lot of cases, it doesn't work. It doesn't apply. If you're in a meeting with a journalist, you cannot, every time the journalist asks a question, you can't answer it with this long-winded story, right? That has a beginning, has an end, and something going astray in between. It just doesn't work. And the other thing, too, is the classic story arc is dependent on some type of failure. And I think this is another one that's a tough one for us in the communications business, because our clients or our companies don't want to talk about failures. You know, I've been in this business now over 30 years, and I've never had a CEO sit down with me and go, okay, Lou, Q2 coming up, what failures do we have to look forward to that we can leverage, right? It doesn't work that way. But there's a way around it. So you can think of failure as a form of contrast. Think of failure as a form of contrast, because the contrast comes from success and failure, right? That's the contrast. And what you can do is you can bring contrast into your content development, into your story, and it ends up being really, really effective. So if you think about kind of what I would characterize as conventional contrast, like what was and what will be, kind of old way, new way, without. These are forms of contrast, and the thing that's really key about contrast is the greater the distance, the greater the gulf between kind of the old way and the new way, the more interesting the story becomes. So even for something as simple as a product introduction, it can be a very effective technique to be able to talk about that old way and what wasn't working so well, and then the new way. But here's something that I think a lot of times gets lost by communicators, or they get shut down by the stakeholders that have control of the content, is contrast requires a frame. Like what was and what will be, right? And again, the wider it is, the better. But a lot of times, companies don't want to talk about the old way. They don't want to talk about it because maybe they view it as a bit negative. Maybe things didn't go terribly well. But you have to anchor that contrast and be willing to talk about it, because if you don't, you have no way, you have no context for what you're talking about. So this idea of contrast is something that we've come to call a storytelling technique. And what you see here is something that we actually put in the public domain earlier this year. It's at storytelling-techniques.com. And you can see here, these are the different techniques that we've kind of pulled out from storytelling that can be applied in communications. And I think what's worth sharing about these techniques is a lot of them came from deconstructing how journalists write long-form journalism, long-form features. So the same techniques that you might see in The Economist, you might see in the FT, you might see in the Business Times, Business Week, Fortune, These techniques are exactly what you find in those stories that give them lift. And it's our belief that these same techniques can be applied on the communication side. And oh, by the way, they end up being incredibly effective in media relations, because now you're constructing content that aligns with how journalists write their stories. So I just want to kind of bring us back to this question that we had asked communicators as part of our survey of kind of what's holding us back with storytelling. What are the three greatest obstacles? And I believe, even though most people didn't call it out, it's expertise. It's expertise. And the one thing that maybe doesn't make the list that belongs here is courage. That we need to have the courage to fight for what we know is right. We need to have the courage to stand up to our clients or our companies to be more outbound, outward in how we communicate. And finally, I just want to make sure we don't lose sight of the big picture. And the big picture, as simplistic as it sounds, is to be able to help our clients, help our companies be more interesting. I went to a lot of the sessions yesterday. And if there was one theme that I took away from all the sessions, it was this idea that attention is a precious commodity. The people that we want to reach, whether they're journalists or whether it's going directly to the target audience or potential customers, they only have so much attention to go around. They only have so much attention to go around, and it's getting worse. So the idea is that by creating content that has more lift and can cut through the noise, we have a greater chance of being able to earn some of that attention. And if we do, that slide I showed you earlier in terms of the incredible growth of the digital universe and digital content and what's going on, as a profession, we will be able to ride that wave, absolutely. But if we don't get better at the content side, I believe that over time we'll be marginalized. We'll be marginalized by digital agencies. We'll be marginalized by advertising and other types of marketing services. So that concludes my talk this morning. My digital touch points are up here. I write a blog that's at ishmaelscorner.com. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. And I think we've got some time for Q&A.
So we're going to take some questions from the audience quite soon. Just a reminder, guys, that the hashtag for today, M360Asia, I think we were trending second in Singapore yesterday, behind Donald Trump, unfortunately. So if you guys can see, some of Lou's slides were fantastic, and I'm sure you have some great opinions about them. Please feel free to share on Twitter with the hashtag. Lou, I'm going to start off quickly. You talked about courage. I think a lot of people in this room will say there's a lot of courage required to talk to the clients about using more storytelling techniques and getting away from the client speak in how they publicize what the client has to say. How do you approach that, and how do you make sure that you can argue that with the client in a positive fashion?
Yeah, that is a tough one. No question about it. We conduct storytelling workshops around these techniques, and we've been doing these for about 7-8 years. We've got a few hundred people out there that have gone through it, and if there's kind of one reason that they come back to me is on that issue, like how do we get through to our stakeholders? So I think there's no kind of magic wand, there's no silver bullet to it. But one thing I will say that we've had some success with is trying to talk in their language. So I didn't show it this morning, but for example, if a client wants to get into the Financial Times, to be able then to show some coverage from the Financial Times, and again, deconstruct the coverage to show how the types of content that are going into the narrative, and be able to talk to them in a more somewhat scientific way of this is how the journalists write. This is the kind of content that we need to provide to align with it. And so there's some logic in trying to help the executive understand that unless we can get that type, we're not going to be able to get you coverage. I think there's a second thing, though, that I would share too, and that is that sometimes you have to enjoy the little victories. And so depending on your company or depending on your client, you can't go from bragging to extraordinary storyteller, in one fell swoop. It sometimes has to go in steps. And so sometimes the way you can find small victories is simply in word selection. I showed that Venn diagram that talked about dullness comes from combining the lexicon of your industry and corporate speak. And here's something I would challenge everyone in the room. If you go out into any company's website, especially B2B companies, and you look at their About section, you will find that it's all, right? It's all industry vernacular and corporate speak, and they all sound alike, and they're all very dull. And so by being able to go outside your industry lexicon, whatever that is, and just find that one word, that kind of jolts you a little bit. In my opinion, even that can be a victory to get through. But I think it's like it is a kind of a never-ending battle. You have to. I think it's even after all these years, we're always fighting for the best content, the right content to win.
Sure. This is the communications and PR industry after all, so I'm assuming that we should have some great questions coming from the audience. Does anyone have any questions they want to ask at the moment? Yep, one over there.
Hi, Lou. Thanks for your presentation today. My name is Glenn, the founder of Van Media Group. We do executive consulting along the lines of presentation skills and storytelling, that sort of thing. The challenge that I run into working with in-house Marcoms folks, many of whom are very, very smart and very switched on, is the tendency to write a news release and then just try to push the news externally, right? And what I try to do, and I'd like to get your view on how you effectively can do it, is first and foremost understand who their audience is going to be, and not push the news, but find out what they need and give the audience the news that they need based on what the company has to offer, with that particular news. This is really tough because since the days of Edward Bernays, the pattern has been write what I want to write about and then push it out to the world and hope that they grab it and listen to it and repeat it. So I guess my question to you is, in the realm of storytelling, this can be a very effective tool to help people see and feel emotional about the news that a company or organization wants to give. So how do you help people understand from the internal corp comms side that they need to really first think about the audience that they're trying to connect with and what their needs are?
Yeah. It's definitely not an easy one that you just described, and I think my experience has been that when you're internal, sometimes there are just so many political dynamics like crushing you every day that you kind of get into this mode where you just want to get stuff done. Not necessarily maybe get it done the right way, but you've got pressures on yourself to get things out the door. So I think that, again, sometimes it can be those little victories that can help. And one, I think with news releases, somehow, and I don't know when it happened, but companies kind of have this attitude that it's my news release, I'm paying for it, so I get to say whatever I want to say. Well, yeah, that's true. I mean, you get to say whatever you want to say, but no one's going to care about it, right? So don't you think don't you want to say something that people actually care about and maybe even write about? So we try to take the discussion in that direction, but speaking candidly, it doesn't always end the way we like it to. And I would not want to leave anyone in this room with the feeling that, we're high and mighty and we've cracked the code on this, because we haven't. And if you did a Google search, you would find my agency's name on some news releases that definitely I'm not proud of. Because there's a pragmatic side to consultancy, right? At some point, you know, if that's what the client wants to do, then we do it.
Any more questions from the audience at this stage? Lou, I think very interesting times in the media industry, of course. Time poor in a lot of areas, and journalists who are going in and out of the industry, it's shrinking somewhat. How do you justify the time it takes to find these great stories and create something there when there's client pressure to just get something out really quickly, and the relationships perhaps that you had with journalists prior maybe aren't the same as what they used to be 5-10 years ago?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I would kind of reframe it a little bit to kind of back up. And if you think about what journalists value today, they value industry stories. They value content that's not in the public domain. And so if you think about where PR spends so much of their time, we spend, and I haven't seen any numbers, but I think if I did, they would be very sobering. The percent of our time gets focused on news announcements. And that's what journalists are actually least interested in, because a news release is a public domain communication, and the internet has really commoditized announcements to a large degree. Now, not totally. I mean, if you're a big player, you know, the journalists still pay attention, but you know, once you get past that top 3%, they don't. And so I think part of the answer to your question is being able to coach clients or coach your companies to put more value on quality, not quantity. That's one. And then two, to understand, I mean, in my company, we call it one-off storytelling. So this idea is to be able to build out content that isn't dependent on news, and that we can kind of mix and match to start to pitch journalists in a way, again, content that aligns with how they're building their stories. But you make a fair point. You know, it's expensive to scale that. And so you do need kind of enlightened clients or enlightened companies that understand it's about, you know, if you can get 5 blurbs, you know, in publications, or you can get, you know, 1 deep feature story. Maybe the blurbs, just the quantity, make you feel better, but the reality is the feature story is going to have more impact on shaping perception. So I think that's part of what's going on in the industry right now. The other thing that kind of pops into my mind too is I feel like one of the real weaknesses in the PR profession and communications, and it relates to storytelling, is how we interview and how we source. And again, I always look to journalists as kind of the bellwether for this, because yeah, it takes time, but often we are getting times with different stakeholders or sources, but we don't ask the right questions. We don't have a sense of understanding how to tease out those anecdotes and get that content and collect it. Because the beauty of once you do that, it can be repurposed. So even though we call it one-off storytelling, it's done more in a linear fashion. So once you've built that, you've pitched it, you've sold it, it's published, a lot of times you can take that same content and kind of rejigger it to go back out with that, again, that one-off story that is not already in the public domain.
Great. We are quickly running out of time, so if anyone does have any questions, oh, there we go, 2, maybe up front first.
Hi, Lou. Emma Jenkins from Lewis Communications. We've talked a lot about storytelling, even, you know, from a verbal and, you know, slightly from a written form. And the latter is what I want to talk to you about is written communications and written content.
Yeah.
And I think that writing clearly aids storytelling. And I want to get your view on what you think is the quality of writing in the communications industry today. I think storytelling is one thing, and I think we know how to storytell. What I think perhaps is a weakness today is our ability to write it down.
Yeah, Yeah, so if I just zero in on that question about the kind of the state of writing in the communications business, oh, God, now I'm going to sound like that old man saying, "Get off my lawn." I think writing, it seems a bit almost like a contradiction to me that writing has never been more important. I mean, content matters, and yet what we see coming out of the universities, because we have part of hiring entry-level people is we have them take a writing test, and we will not hire someone who cannot pass that test. And I'm sad to report, I don't know if it's any different in Asia, but in the US, over 50% of those college grads cannot pass a writing test. So that isn't good because it's not a high bar. You know, can you put a noun and a verb together? So I think I feel like that has to change, and I think one way that we do it is through a fair amount of internal training and holding our folks to a pretty high bar. And two, I think it gets back to maybe a little bit of courage too of as a consultancy who you work with, and trying to get ourselves into situations in terms of fit where we're working with clients that value good writing. Because in defense of the communications profession, sometimes it's internal stakeholders that hurt the writing. That you try to go outward, and you know kind of the downside of the digital is like people feel like they can keep adding, right? There's no cost to it. It's not like it's being printed, and so by the time you're done going through the review kind of meat grinder, the content isn't very good.
Unfortunately, we are dead out of time, so a note that the next session in this room is Global Social PR Media Disasters, the lessons from United Airlines and Pepsi, among others, which is sure to be extraordinarily interesting. If you haven't done so, please download the Mumbrella 360 Asia app, which will give you all the information on the sessions today and more. Don't forget to use that hashtag M360Asia so we can catch Donald Trump. And please join me with a massive round of applause for Lou Hoffman.
Thank you.